The sun had barely risen over the Bavarian hills when the soldiers of the U.S. 45th Infantry Division approached the gates of Dachau. What they expected was the chaos of a retreating enemy, perhaps a few prisoners left behind, but nothing could prepare them for what awaited. As the gates creaked open, the air itself seemed heavy, thick with the stench of death and decay. The first bodies they saw were skeletal figures, frozen in silence, their eyes hollow, their limbs twisted from weeks of suffering. Many were crammed into overcrowded train cars that had traveled in darkness for days. Soldiers stepped carefully, unsure if the grotesque scene was real or some nightmare conjured by exhaustion and fear. They quickly realized that this was no ordinary camp. In the station yard, dozens of rail cars lined up, their doors thrown open. Inside, over 2,000 men, women, and children lay dead, stacked in horrific piles, their clothes tattered, skin pale or blackened, a testament to starvation, disease, and the cruelty of those who had sent them here. The soldiers froze. Some turned away, vomiting, their stomachs rebelling against the sight of humanity reduced to corpses. Others moved mechanically, trying to record names, numbers, faces, anything that might make sense of this endless horror. One young sergeant described it later as a moment that broke something inside me. Many soldiers whispered to one another, trying to anchor themselves to reality. They found handwritten notes, crude tally marks, scraps of bread, and meager possessions, evidence that these people had been alive, thinking, hoping, dreaming before the camp had claimed them. The more they walked through the train cars, the heavier the silence became. Every step revealed another layer of the unimaginable. People piled on top of one another, some clinging to life for hours, others already stiff and cold, forgotten by the world outside. Outside the rail cars, the camp itself revealed further horrors. Inmates, some barely able to walk, stared with hollow eyes as soldiers tried to offer water, blankets, and comfort. They had survived weeks, even months of brutality, witnessing friends, family, and neighbors die under the watch of the SS guards, who now stood nervously behind barbed wire, unsure how to respond. The soldiers noticed small details that revealed the depths of cruelty. Scratched messages etched into walls, bones lying in corners, tools used as instruments of torture. It was clear that every inch of Dachau was steeped in suffering, a place designed to strip people of dignity, of hope, of humanity itself. As the soldiers moved further into the camp, the psychological weight of what they saw became unbearable. The human mind has limits, and even trained men, hardened by combat, began to reach theirs. Some wept openly. Others whispered curses, unable to contain the mixture of horror and rage. They had fought in Europe for months, even years, but this was different. The sheer scale of deliberate suffering, the evidence of methodical murder, pushed them to the edge. Many later admitted that at that moment, any sense of military restraint, of protocol, seemed meaningless. And yet, despite the overwhelming despair, there was an urgency in the soldiers' movements. They had to document, to witness, to ensure that the world would know what had been done here. Photographs were taken, notes jotted down, and names recorded when possible. Some soldiers carried survivors to safer areas, helping them to clean water, food, and first aid. These acts, small in comparison to the horrors around them, were a reminder that amidst the darkness, human compassion still persisted. But even these small acts of care were tempered by anger, by the sense that the men responsible for this monstrosity had to pay a price. By midday, the camp was still a chaotic mixture of life and death. Soldiers walked among the dead, some in silence, others speaking in low, trembling voices. In one corner, a group of men uncovered a cache of human remains that had been hidden, bodies carefully arranged as if to hide the evidence. In another area, the prisoners began to recognize their liberators, and murmurs of gratitude spread, though their expressions were haunted by memories too fresh to forget. The soldiers, now fully aware of the unimaginable scale of Dachau's cruelty, could not escape the question that burned in their minds. How could human beings commit such acts, and how could anyone remain indifferent to them? As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the barracks, the soldiers gathered themselves, but the images lingered, etched into their minds forever. The death train, the skeletal bodies, the hollow eyes of the survivors, all of it combined into a vision that would define the liberation of Dachau. It was a moment of triumph, yes, the end of a nightmare for those who survived, but it was also a moment of horror so profound that even victory could not erase it. This was only the beginning, a prelude to the events that would test the soldiers' humanity, their sense of justice, and the very limits of moral restraint.
The shock of what they had seen in the death train still clung to the soldiers' minds as they moved deeper into Dachau. The stench of decay, the twisted faces of the dead, and the hollow, haunted eyes of the survivors created a tension that was almost unbearable. Something inside the men of the U.S. 45th Infantry Division began to change. Years of discipline, of training to follow orders, of understanding the rules of war, suddenly felt distant, almost meaningless. What they had witnessed was beyond any code of conduct. They had seen the results of systematic cruelty on a scale that defied comprehension. Whispers spread among the soldiers, "No prisoners." At first, it was a murmured response to the horror, a grim acknowledgement of their anger. But soon, it became a rallying cry, a raw and unfiltered reflection of the emotions boiling beneath the surface. The SS guards, who had once commanded fear and authority, now appeared small, fragile, and completely exposed. Soldiers who had spent weeks in combat now found themselves facing a different enemy, one defined not by strategy or skill, but by pure, unthinkable evil. Each guard represented the suffering of thousands, every twitch of their body a reminder of the torture and starvation inflicted on innocent people. One group of soldiers discovered a set of camp records meticulously kept by the SS. Lists of names, dates, and assignments painted a chilling picture of premeditated cruelty. Men who had hidden behind regulations, following orders from afar, were now standing before the men they had tormented. Some soldiers felt a strange sense of disbelief. How could these humans have lived ordinary lives outside this camp, yet commit acts so monstrous inside it? The question fueled the rage that simmered among the troops. The tension escalated when soldiers came across the first group of surrendering SS guards. Their hands were raised, uniforms tattered, faces pale, as if they expected mercy. But the soldiers did not feel mercy. They felt outrage. For months they had watched the world bleed under the iron grip of Nazi power, but Dachau made it personal. This was not just a battle, this was a reckoning. Orders, regulations, the rules of engagement, all of it seemed distant and irrelevant. The soldiers' anger was tangible, almost a physical force pressing down on everyone in the camp. In quiet corners, small groups of men gathered, speaking in hushed tones about what should be done. Some argued for restraint, for keeping prisoners for trial, for documenting every detail for justice. Others shook their heads, voices low but resolute, insisting that these guards had forfeited any right to mercy. Memories of emaciated survivors, of families torn apart, and of the children found among the dead fueled their determination. Every step deeper into the camp seemed to magnify their sense of moral outrage. Meanwhile, the surviving prisoners began to stir, their faces etched with a mix of hope and caution. Some recognized the liberators, nodding silently, while others remained still, unsure if freedom had truly arrived. The soldiers were aware of their responsibility to protect these survivors, yet their focus kept returning to the SS guards. Some soldiers even whispered darkly about what they might do if they were left unchecked, imagining a swift justice delivered in the moment. The line between justice and vengeance was already blurring, a dangerous space where rage and morality collided. By midday, the soldiers were organizing themselves to secure the camp, but the psychological strain was evident. Their hands shook, voices carried an edge of anger, and eyes constantly scanned the surrounding area for any sign of threat. Each new discovery, a hidden execution site, a pile of corpses, evidence of torture, reinforced the growing sense that conventional military discipline could not address what they had witnessed. The soldiers were caught between the need to maintain order and the irresistible pull of immediate, brutal justice. Even as they continued their work, a grim determination spread through the troops. They knew that the world would later want a sanitized version of events, a version in which the liberators remained heroes and the SS guards were merely imprisoned. But in that moment, nothing seemed simple. Nothing could contain the rage, the grief, and the disbelief that had taken hold. Soldiers whispered to each other about the imaginable cruelty, about the faces they would never forget, and about the prisoners who had survived against all odds. They knew that what they were about to do, or might be forced to do, would not be clean, would not be comfortable, and would not fit neatly into the history books. And yet the soldiers pressed forward. With each step, the line between duty and vengeance blurred further. Orders, honor, and protocol weighed against the visceral need to respond to evil with swift action. The moment had arrived when their humanity would be tested, not by the skill of an enemy soldier in battle, but by the sheer magnitude of human cruelty. The choice they faced was stark: follow the rules of war or answer to the outrage burning inside them. The air was thick with tension, and the soldiers knew, deep down, that Dachau had changed them forever.
The coal yard of Dachau was quiet, almost deceptively so, as the soldiers of the U.S. 45th Infantry Division approached. What lay ahead was a place that had once been mundane, filled with carts, tools, and ash, but now it held the weight of human judgment, the kind of moment where the rules of war collided with raw emotion. The soldiers had already seen the death train, witnessed skeletal bodies stacked like firewood, and felt the hollow eyes of survivors pierce their souls. But this moment, this place, would test their limits in a way nothing else had. The SS guards, lined up with hands trembling or raised in surrender, were unaware of the storm that had built behind the rifles aimed at them. Months of witnessing cruelty, months of seeing emaciated prisoners, and months of fighting for the liberation of the innocent had reached a breaking point. Soldiers whispered to one another, their voices low but tense, a mix of fear, anger, and grim anticipation. Some had sworn to follow military codes, to take prisoners, to document everything for history. But the evidence before them, the faces of the dead, the shouts of survivors, the twisted remnants of lives destroyed, made such restraint almost impossible. Eyewitnesses would later describe the moment as surreal. Soldiers stood in formation, their rifles steady in hands that were anything but calm. The guards, pale and defiant in equal measure, tried to make eye contact, hoping perhaps for mercy, for some recognition of shared humanity. But the soldiers could see only the years of cruelty etched into their faces, the commands they had obeyed, the orders that had led to mass starvation, beatings, and death. It was no longer about individual guilt or innocence. It was about the cumulative weight of atrocity. The first shots rang out. The sound echoed off the walls of the coal yard, sharp and jarring, cutting through the tense silence. Some guards fell instantly, others staggered, the terror in their eyes reflecting a fear they had once instilled in others. Soldiers moved with a grim purpose, machine guns steady, their movements coordinated yet fueled by emotion rather than protocol. Each pull of the trigger was a mixture of shock, anger, and an almost primitive need for justice. It was a reckoning that no court could administer, a moment where the full scale of human cruelty met the equally raw intensity of human outrage. Despite the chaos, soldiers were aware of the gravity of their actions. They did not celebrate. There were no triumphant shouts, no victorious cheers. There was only a tense, almost reverent focus, as if acknowledging that they were witnesses to a dark form of justice. Some soldiers later admitted that they struggled to reconcile what they had done with who they were. The line between punishment and murder was razor thin, and in the coal yard it had been crossed. Prisoners who had watched from the edges of the camp could hardly comprehend what they were seeing. Some wept, others murmured prayers or cursed in disbelief. Their reactions mirrored the soldiers' own inner conflict. These men and women who had been stripped of hope and subjected to unimaginable horror now saw the captors brought low, but the victory was shadowed by the grim reality of human revenge. No one could deny the raw satisfaction in seeing the oppressors fall, yet a heavy moral question lingered. At what cost had justice been served? The soldiers moved methodically, sweeping through the yard to ensure no guard was overlooked, each step deliberate, each action marked by the same grim determination that had carried them through the death train. In corners and behind makeshift barricades, evidence of cruelty remained: shattered personal effects, scraps of clothing, the remnants of brutal punishments. Each item seemed to whisper the suffering that had taken place, reinforcing the soldiers' conviction that their actions, however extreme, were a response to something far greater than themselves. By the end of the day, the coal yard bore the weight of history, a place transformed from mundane worksite to a grim theater of reckoning. The soldiers were exhausted, their bodies trembling with fatigue, but their minds raced with questions and memories that would not fade. The horror they had witnessed, the orders they had defied, and the acts they had committed would follow them for the rest of their lives. And yet, for a brief moment, amidst the smoke and echoes of gunfire, there was a sense of grim resolution. Justice, messy, brutal, and irrevocable, had been served, but it was a kind of justice that would haunt both survivors and liberators for decades to come.
The shadow of Tower B loomed over the camp, its walls cold and unyielding, a stark reminder of the power once wielded by the SS guards. Soldiers approached cautiously, aware that the reprisal they had begun in the coal yard was far from over. The air was thick with tension, the smell of gunpowder lingering from earlier actions, mixing with the ever-present stench of death. Here, the remaining guards had little choice but to face the consequences of the horrors they had inflicted on thousands of innocent people. The first guards were lined up against the tower walls, their faces pale and eyes wide, a mixture of fear and disbelief etched in every line. For months they had commanded terror, but now they were stripped of authority, completely exposed. Soldiers raised their rifles once more, the weight of duty mingled with the raw, almost primal urge for retribution. The sound of shots rang out, echoing off the stone walls, harsh and unrelenting. Some guards fell immediately, others stumbled, their cries cut short by the relentless execution. It was a grim scene, a continuation of the justice that had begun in the coal yard, yet darker in its immediacy. As the soldiers carried out their grim task, prisoners began to stir. Those who had survived weeks of torture and starvation now emerged, their eyes still haunted but burning with a desire for their own form of revenge. Some picked up shovels, wooden sticks, or anything they could grasp, moving cautiously toward the guards. The liberated inmates, once powerless, now had the chance to confront those who had tormented them. Their actions were driven not by military orders, but by years of suffering and a need to reclaim some measure of dignity. Each swing of a shovel, each blow was both a release of pent-up rage and a testament to the human instinct for survival and justice. Soldiers watched closely, aware that what was happening blurred the lines of morality. The prisoners' revenge was brutal, chaotic, and personal, yet it was a mirror to the calculated cruelty the guards had once wielded. Some soldiers intervened when it became too extreme, pulling individuals back to prevent complete chaos, while others simply observed, recognizing that this raw justice was part of the human response to unspeakable cruelty.
The atmosphere was electric with emotion, a mixture of triumph, fear, and disbelief at how quickly the roles of power had shifted. In the moat beneath Tower B, bodies were found discarded, thrown from the tower in a grim echo of the violence that had dominated the camp. Soldiers and prisoners alike navigated the area cautiously, witnessing the consequences of unchecked rage and the desperation for justice. Every detail, twisted limbs, shattered uniforms, blood-soaked ground, served as a reminder of the immense psychological toll of Dachau. The camp, once a place of fear and oppression, had now become a scene of reckoning, a place where the powerless had gained agency and the oppressors had been reduced to vulnerability. Throughout the day, soldiers moved among both prisoners and surviving guards, balancing a need for order with an understanding that the psychological scars would not fade quickly. Witnessing former prisoners confront their tormentors was surreal. Their faces, pale and gaunt, yet resolute, reflected a mixture of sorrow and anger. Some guards begged for mercy, tears streaming down their faces, while others remained stoic, perhaps in disbelief that the world they had controlled for so long had crumbled so completely in a single day. As night fell, the camp was quiet once more, but the tension remained palpable. The liberators and the liberated alike knew that the events of the day would haunt them indefinitely. The psychological weight of Tower B, the prisoners' revenge, and the executions of the guards left a mark not only on the survivors, but also on the soldiers who had been forced to witness and participate in these acts. Dachau had become more than a camp. It had become a crucible, a place where the deepest human emotions, fear, anger, sorrow, and vindication had collided in ways that would forever challenge their understanding of justice. The liberation of Dachau was no longer a simple victory over the Nazis. It had become a complex, morally charged moment where human response to evil took raw, sometimes uncontrollable forms. The tower, the moat, the prisoners' shovels, all of it was part of a story that could not be sanitized. The echoes of gunfire, the cries of the prisoners, and the sobs of those who had survived blended into a haunting symphony, a reminder that liberation sometimes comes with a cost far beyond what anyone could have imagined.
The liberation of Dachau left scars that went far beyond the physical. Soldiers, prisoners, and even the camp itself bore witness to events that history would struggle to capture. But as the immediate chaos settled, another layer of the story began to emerge, one that would be shrouded in secrecy and controversy for decades. General George S. Patton, commander of the Third Army, was faced with a decision that would shape how the world remembered Dachau. Reports of the reprisals, of the shootings in the coal yard, the executions at Tower B, and the prisoners' own acts of revenge had reached his desk. The details were horrifying, but they were also politically explosive. Patton, known for his fierce approach to warfare and his understanding of the psychological toll on soldiers, made a controversial choice. Rather than pursuing a formal court-martial for the soldiers involved, he ordered the reports burned. The reasoning was complex. He feared that prosecuting American troops, already traumatized by what they had seen and endured, would further damage morale, undermine military discipline, and detract from the narrative of liberation. In his mind, the acts at Dachau were a response to unimaginable evil, a human reaction to horrors that defied regulation or legal precedent. The cover-up was as much about preserving the soldiers as it was about protecting the reputation of the army. Historians have debated Patton's decision ever since. Was it a pragmatic choice made to shield his men from the impossible burden of legal scrutiny? Or was it an act that obscured the truth, allowing a moment of brutal vengeance to be hidden from public accountability? Evidence suggests that the burning of the reports erased the official record of the reprisals, leaving historians to piece together the events from survivor testimony, private letters, and photographs smuggled out of the camp. The lack of documentation created a shadow over the liberation, a moral ambiguity that continues to provoke debate. Meanwhile, the soldiers who had carried out the reprisals returned to their units, carrying not only physical exhaustion, but a deep psychological burden. Some were haunted by the faces of the SS guards, the echoes of gunfire, and the cries of survivors who had both cheered and feared the acts of vengeance. Others found a strange sense of closure in what they had done, a feeling that justice, messy and brutal though it was, had been served. Yet even this was tempered by guilt, by the awareness that in taking vengeance, they had stepped beyond the ordinary bounds of military conduct. Prisoners who had survived Dachau were left to reconcile their liberation with the violence they had witnessed and, in some cases, enacted themselves. For them, the moment was bittersweet. They were free, yet surrounded by death, with their oppressors either dead or broken, and the world outside still struggling to understand the magnitude of what had occurred. The camp had been a place of horror, but it had also become a place where the raw human need for justice, both official and personal, was on full display. The legacy of Dachau's liberation is complex. It is remembered as a moment of triumph, of freedom, and of moral clarity for a world emerging from the shadow of the Third Reich. Yet beneath that triumph lies a darker, almost unspoken truth. The shootings, the reprisals, and the acts of revenge challenged conventional ideas of morality, of law, and of what it means to confront evil. Soldiers and prisoners alike acted not only as liberators and victims, but as agents of immediate, unmediated justice, a response driven by anger, grief, and the sheer weight of human suffering. Even today, the events at Dachau force a reckoning with uncomfortable questions. When does justice become vengeance? Can human morality survive exposure to systematic, industrialized evil? And how should history remember acts that are neither entirely heroic nor wholly criminal, but something in between? Patton's cover-up ensured that official records remained silent, leaving future generations to reconstruct the narrative and wrestle with these moral dilemmas. Dachau's liberation was a victory, but it was also a mirror, reflecting the darkest and most complex impulses of the human heart. In the end, Dachau teaches a profound lesson about war, justice, and humanity. Liberation was achieved, but at the cost of moral clarity. Soldiers and survivors alike were changed forever, carrying memories that could never be erased. The photographs, letters, and survivor accounts that emerged later became the only witnesses to the events the official records had concealed. It is a story of triumph shadowed by tragedy, of revenge tempered by heroism, and the enduring struggle to understand how humans confront unimaginable evil. In the quiet moments after the liberation, when the camp was finally empty of guards and the prisoners had begun to heal, the soldiers knew something indelible had been etched into history, something that would challenge every notion of justice for generations to come.